Welcome to the fifth lecture in the Henry VIII series. Today we will examine the question of why did Henry VIII dissolve the monasteries between 1535 and 1540. As part of this we will be looking especially at the role of Henry's chief minister Thomas Cromwell. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. The first section will examine Cromwell's new role of Vicar General and Cromwell's religious motivations for the dissolution of the monasteries. Then we will examine the chronology of events that saw the systematic closure of one of England's greatest known institutions. We will then examine the social impact, in other words, the impact of the dissolution on ordinary people. Finally, we will examine the political impact for Henry, for Cromwell, and for those MPs in Parliament who supported this radical change. In January 1535, Thomas Cromwell was given a new official role within government, that of Vicar General, sometimes known as Vicegerent of Spirituals. This essentially gave Cromwell power over church policy. This was highly unusual since Cromwell was not an ordained member of the church, but rather a trained lawyer. Furthermore, Cromwell had by 1535 made his Lutheran beliefs clear, and so his promotion to this role meant that Henry sanctioned further reform to the church. Cromwell worked closely alongside Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who by 1535 was drafting Lutheran changes to church doctrine. However, Cromwell's principal concern was the monasteries. By the 1530s, there were approximately 900 monastic houses all across England. This included approximately 140 nunneries and 180 friaries. Roughly 12,000 people were members of a religious order, some of which lived in large and remote communities. Essentially, this made monasticism an institution in England, and it was one where each member owed their allegiance to the Catholic Church, and therefore the Pope. They were also a very well-respected institution. The larger houses especially provided a sense of awe and wonder to the normal folk. Many would complete pilgrimages to their local monastery, which hosted holy relics. This gave the monasteries a tremendous amount of power over the ordinary people. However, the institution had faced heavy criticism in recent years, especially from Lutherans. Many religious orders had been allowed to self-govern, and therefore discipline had lapsed over time. Many monks no longer stuck to the Saint Benedictine vows of poverty, obedience and celibacy. For example, the figure of Friar Tuck the Jolly, overweight and borderline alcoholic friar, was a popular figure in Robin Hood stories told during the 16th century. He was a parody, but he represented many people's perception of monks and friars. One of the biggest accusations made against the monastic orders was that they formed part of a corrupt institution. This was an argument that Cromwell keenly believed, as a committed Lutheran. This is because the main purpose of the monasteries was to provide prayers for the deliverance of the souls of the dead. The local nobility would pay handsome sums of money to become benefactors of their local monastery, and thus to have prayers constantly delivered for the souls of their family members. In the eyes of Cromwell and his circle of Lutheran supporters, this was the very essence of corruption. Given Cromwell's strong Lutheran beliefs, it is no wonder that he made the monasteries his main priority in his new role of Vicar General. However, it is worth noting that he was not the first of Henry's chief ministers to investigate the problem. In 1519, Thomas Wolsey completed his own investigation, which resulted in the closure of 29 monasteries due to either blatant corruption, or poor governance. He also issued a report with strict instructions for the monks to obey their vows, with a specific focus on the vow of celibacy, something which earned him accusations of hypocrisy since he had a long-term mistress and 2 acknowledged bastards. Let's now examine the chronology of the dissolution of the monasteries. In 1535, Cromwell assembled a team of trusted servants, who would become the commissioners. It was their job to conduct a thorough investigation that would justify the closure or serious reform of the monasteries. Historians disagree about whether it was Henry's intent to close all the monasteries, or whether this decision was made later, following the Pilgrimage of Grace rebellion. Nonetheless, Cromwell started out with a clear mission. He even employed Lutheran preachers to perform sermons that openly criticized the monastic orders. In 1535, the commissioners traveled across the country and investigated the state of each monastery. They wrote detailed and often juicy reports about what they discovered. For example, they reported pregnant nuns, abbots who were hiding mistresses, and monks who visited the local brothels. They also reported a range of false relics and idols. For example, one monastery had numerous splinters of wood that the monastery claimed had been part of the original cross of Christ. By 1536, all these juicy tidbits were meticulously recorded in what became known as the Comperta Monastica. The commissioners had essentially gone into the monasteries with the clear mission to find fault and provide judgment. They did not report the positive examples of piety and charity. This report provided a clear moral judgment against the monasteries, and this would have helped Cromwell to sway Henry to his next course of action. At the same time, in 1535, the commissioners completed a financial report of every monastery. Historians have dubbed this the monastic domesday, as it provides a comprehensive and mostly objective account of the financial worth of every religious house in England. This included the amount of land owned by every monastery and all important assets. If Henry was not swayed by the moral argument posed by the Comperta Monastica, he was certainly swayed by the financial incentive provided by the Valor Ecclesiasticus. Parliament met in February 1536, and Cromwell presented the Valor Ecclesiasticus and Comperta Monastica to the MPs. At this point, he introduced a bill for the closure of religious houses that had an income of less than £200 a year. This would have included many convents and friaries, as these were not large houses. The justification was that these smaller houses had shown greater evidence of corruption, though this was not necessarily true. Some historians believe that the closure of the lesser monasteries was Cromwell's way of testing the waters, to see how the public would react, before moving to the much larger and more powerful houses. Others argue that Cromwell still intended to introduce reform to the larger monasteries. In September 1536, a popular rebellion began in rural Lincolnshire, and by October it had spread to Yorkshire. The rebellion was the largest of the Tudor age, numbering 40,000 at its peak. One of the main grievances of the rebels, who called themselves pilgrims, was the protection of the monasteries. It was a clear signal from the north of England that the people were angry with the closure of the smaller monasteries. Some historians believe the Pilgrimage of Grace was a turning point for Henry, in that it convinced Henry that the institution needed to be fully destroyed, as it was too popular, and therefore too powerful to survive even with reform. Therefore, in 1539, there was a second act passed through Parliament. This time, for the dissolution of all monasteries, despite their annual income. The closure of all the remaining monasteries took place over the following 2 years at rapid speed. Many monasteries attempted to pay handsome fees to remain open. This kept them open for a further year or two, but by Cromwell's death in July 1540, the vast majority were closed. Cromwell had broken this once great institution, but it would turn out that he had done so at great personal cost. The monasteries were not simply closed down. The royal commissioners stripped them of all their wealth. All golden ornaments were taken and molten down. Many buildings were dismantled for their stone, which was used to create new plush manor houses. This is one of the reasons why all the monasteries that survive to modern day are derelict. Mere skeletons of what they once were. The wealth gained was so great that Cromwell had to create a new financial court to deal with the influx of new revenue. It was aptly called the Court of Augmentation, since augmentation means the process of something growing or increasing. This, the royal treasury most certainly did. Let's now examine the social impact of the dissolution of the monasteries. The first and most obvious impact was that it resulted in the immediate unemployment of approximately 12,000 people. Many would have fallen into poverty, though others were able to return to their home villages and live traditional lives. The worst hit were the elderly, especially nuns, who could not find work. They were left destitute. The second important social impact was the loss of social services. For example, the monasteries were the closest that England had to hotels during the 16th century. It was the Christian duty of the monks to admit any traveler that needed safe refuge for the night. For many travelers, they would plan their route between different monastic houses that could offer overnight accommodation. Furthermore, the larger monasteries had infirmaries, which were the closest England had to hospitals. This is because many monastic orders believed in service to the local community as part of their vows. Similarly, many would often provide long-term refuge for the elderly and infirm, who did not have a family to care for them. In this sense, they were the Tudor equivalent to a care home. Another fundamental role of the monasteries was the giving of alms to the poor. This could be payment in coins, or in kind, to meet the needs of the most impoverished in the community. Many monasteries had faced criticism for hoarding their wealth and not giving out enough in alms, but even if this was the case, this still left a huge amount of money that was no longer being given out as charity to those who most needed it in society. In this sense, you could say that the closure of the monasteries saw the end of any kind of welfare or benefits system in England. Finally, the local community was no longer given the spiritual comfort they once received from their local monastic order. Many had looked on their local monastery with a sense of awe and reverence. They had performed pilgrimages to pray at the relics and seek absolution for their worldly transgressions. As a result, the monasteries were a much-loved institution for many. Put together, the dissolution of the monasteries provided a vacuum of need. As a result, poverty and vagrancy would become an increasingly serious problem throughout the second half of the 16th century. It would not be properly resolved until the Poor Laws that were passed through Parliament at the end of Elizabeth's reign. Let's now examine the political impact of the dissolution of the monasteries. Firstly, and most importantly, the dissolution of the monasteries made the break with Rome permanent. Before this, the key changes had been legislative, and all these laws could have been repealed. In October 1537, Henry finally received his long-awaited son, Edward, by his third wife Jane Seymour, and nobody could deny Edward's legitimacy. Therefore, Henry could have stopped at the closure of the smaller monasteries and sought reconciliation with the Church. Instead, he pushed ahead with the closure of the larger and more powerful monasteries. This, more than anything, tells me that the break with Rome was no longer about the king's great matter. It was now about the gain of absolute sovereignty over his realm. Furthermore, the dissolution of the monasteries is another example of how Parliament was used to enable a major overhaul of the Church. This once again bolstered the power of Parliament as a legislative body, even though it remained largely subservient to the king and his wishes. It would be Parliament that would play a fundamental part in the creation of the new laws that helped to establish the welfare state at the end of Elizabeth's reign. One could therefore argue that Parliament had started to replace the monasteries as a powerful and necessary institution of England. Within Parliament, there were a number of MPs and lesser lords that had shown their support for the dissolution of the monasteries. They would become the vanguard of Henry's new church. To reward them, Henry sold much of the monastic lands at a below market value price. This gave them greater power in their region, which in turn created a new ruling class of Protestants, who would hold huge swathes of power right through to the modern day. Of course, Henry himself gained tremendously from the dissolution of monasteries. He was quick to sell the monastic lands in order to replenish the depleted royal treasury. In the late 1530s, he genuinely feared that he might need this money to defend England's shores from a united Catholic crusade, from a holy league of powerful European nations. However, in the 1540s, the Habsburg-Valois conflict resumed between France and Spain. Henry, of course, used his newfound wealth to stage another campaign in France, in what became a satirical repeat of his earlier expeditions. Finally, Cromwell himself gained wealth and power from the dissolution of the monasteries. In April 1540, Henry elevated him to the title of Earl of Essex, and by this point he held as much personal wealth as the traditional noble magnates. However, his success would be his downfall. Only 3 months later, he would fall victim to a court conspiracy led by the Duke of Norfolk and executed for heresy and treason. Let's now return to our overarching question of, why did Henry VIII dissolve the monasteries between 1535 and 1540? Firstly, Henry was heavily influenced by his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who in 1535 was appointed Vicar General of the Church, and so given license to investigate the corruption of the monasteries. The dissolution of the monasteries was completed in stages. Firstly, in 1535, there was a year of fact-finding, which resulted in 2 important reports called the Comperta Monastica and the Velo Ecclesiasticus. Secondly, there was the dissolution of the lesser monasteries in 1536, which helped to cause a huge popular rebellion called the Pilgrimage of Grace. Then, 3 years later, in 1539, an Act of Parliament called for the dissolution of the greater monasteries. This closed down all the remaining monasteries. The dissolution of the monasteries had a tremendous social impact since England now lacked important social services, such as hospitality for travelers and infirmaries for the sick. This would result in a rise in poverty and vagrancy throughout the second half of the 16th century. Furthermore, there was also a great political impact. The dissolution of the monasteries put the seal on the break with Rome, and it bolstered Henry's sovereignty as head of the Church. It also provided financial benefit, not just for Henry, but also those opportunists who bought into the Reformation by purchasing monastic land. Henceforth, it would be these newly enriched lords who would become the bedrock of regional power in England. Thank you for watching. Tune into the next lecture to learn about the role that Thomas Cranmer played in the Henrician Reformation and the doctrinal changes to the Church.